On a Thursday morning in September 1977, three brothers stood in their father's equipment shed in Hamilton County, Nebraska, staring at machinery that had arrived 2 days earlier and wasn't supposed to be there. A brand new John Deere 4640, gleaming green and yellow, 150 horsepower of turbocharged diesel power. A new six-bottom plow, still wrapped in protective plastic. A new 12-row planter that could cover ground faster than anything they'd ever seen. And a new grain cart with capacity that dwarfed their old wagon. Total value, approximately $142,000. All finance, all purchased and signed for by their father, Walter Garrett, without consulting them, without asking their opinion, without even telling them until the delivery trucks rolled into the farmyard. Walter, 68 years old and still sharp as a tack, had made the decision unilaterally because it was his farm, his name on the deed, and he believed after 47 years of farming that he knew what was necessary. His three sons, Frank, 43, Daniel, 40, and Joseph, 36, who'd been working that farm alongside their father for their entire adult lives, who'd been promised for years that the operation would eventually transition to them, who'd built their families and their futures around the assumption that they'd inherit a debt-free operation the way their father had inherited it from his father, stood there looking at $142,000 worth of equipment debt and came to a unanimous conclusion. This had to go back. What happened over the next 72 hours tore the Garrett family apart, changed the trajectory of three farming careers, and taught a brutal lesson about control, succession, and the moment when a patriarch authority collides with his son's financial survival. Before I explain exactly how three grown men convinced their father to return over $140,000 worth of brand new farm equipment, you need to understand the family dynamics and the economic context that made this confrontation inevitable. Walter Garrett had started farming in 1930, taking over the family's 320-acre operation when his own father died of pneumonia. Walter had been 21 years old, farming through the Great Depression with used equipment and no margin for error. He'd survived by being conservative, by never spending money he didn't have, by maintaining equipment until it literally couldn't be repaired anymore. He'd expanded the farm to 640 acres by 1955, buying land slowly with cash saved from good years. And he'd raised three sons on that land, teaching them the same principles. Work hard, save money, avoid debt, and the farm will take care of you. His sons had followed those principles. Frank, the oldest, had married in 1958 and built a house on the northeast corner of the property. He and his wife had 4 kids, all grown now, and Frank had been the de facto farm manager for the past decade as Walter's health had started to decline. Daniel had married in 1962, built a house on the southwest section, had 3 kids, and handled most of the equipment maintenance and repair. Joseph, the youngest, had married in 1970, lived in town but worked the farm full-time, and managed the financial records and grain marketing. The 3 brothers worked together smoothly, sharing labor and decision-making, with Walter still nominally in charge, but increasingly deferring to them on operational matters. The family operated as a partnership, though not a legal one. Walter owned everything, the land, the equipment, the bank accounts. But the understanding, never formalized but repeated countless times over the years, was that the farm would eventually be divided 3 ways. Each son would inherit roughly 213 acres plus a share of the equipment, and they'd continue farming either independently or cooperatively, depending on what made sense. The critical assumption underlying all of this was that the farm would be debt-free when the transition happened. Walter had always been adamant about that. "I'm not going to saddle you boys with debt," he'd said 100 times. "When this farm is yours, it'll be free and clear, just like my father left it to me." Except in September of 1977, Walter had apparently changed his mind about debt. The equipment sitting in the shed represented a loan of $130,000. He put down $12,000 in cash, financed over 7 years at 9.25% interest. The monthly payment was approximately $2,150. Annual debt service, $25,800. For a farm that typically netted $45,000 to $50,000 per year split informally among 4 people. This was a massive new obligation, and Walter had done it without consulting anyone. The brothers found out about the purchase when the delivery trucks arrived on Tuesday morning. Frank had been working in the Northfield when he saw the semi-trucks turn into the farm lane. He'd driven back to the farmyard, thinking maybe it was a delivery for a neighbor who'd gotten the address wrong. Instead, he found his father directing the unloading of the 4640, looking pleased with himself. "Dad, what is this?" Walter had smiled. "New equipment. About time, don't you think? That 4020 we've been running is 15 years old. This 4640 is a real tractor, 150 horsepower. We can finally farm this place efficiently." Frank had felt his stomach drop. How much did this cost? "Don't worry about it. I handled it." "Dad, how much?" Walter's smile had faded slightly. "The whole package is $142,000. I finance $130,000. 7-year note. Payment's about $25,000 a year. We can handle it." Frank had stared at his father. $25,000 a year? "Dad, that's half our net income." We can't." Walter had cut him off. "I can, and I did. This is my farm, Frank. I make the equipment decisions. You boys will benefit from this just like I will." Frank had immediately called Daniel and Joseph. By Tuesday afternoon, all three brothers were in Walter's living room, and the conversation was tense. Daniel, normally the peacemaker, spoke first. "Dad, we need to understand what you were thinking. This is a huge financial commitment. Why didn't you talk to us first?" Walter had bristled. "I don't need permission from my sons to make farm decisions. I've been farming since before any of you were born." Joseph, the youngest but often the most direct, leaned forward. "Dad, with respect, this isn't just your decision anymore. We all work this farm. We all depend on the income. And you've always told us this farm would be ours someday. If you saddle it with $130,000 in debt, that affects our future." Walter's face had reddened. "The farm is mine until I say otherwise. And this equipment will increase productivity enough to more than cover the payments." Frank shook his head. "Dad, we ran the numbers. We'd need to increase yields by maybe 15% just to break even on the additional cost. And we can't guarantee that. What we can guarantee is that we'll be making a $25,000 payment every year for the next 7 years, whether we have a good year or a bad year." Walter stood up, ended the conversation. "The equipment stays." Discussion over. But the brothers didn't accept that. That night, the three of them met at Frank's house with their wives. The consensus was clear. This debt was going to destroy the farm's financial stability and jeopardize everyone's future. They needed to convince Walter to return the equipment while they still could. The dealership had a 10-day return policy for finance purchases if the loan hadn't been fully disbursed yet. They had maybe a week to act. Wednesday morning, Frank called the John Deere dealer, a man named Gerald Krause who'd been selling equipment in Hamilton County for 20 years. "Gerald, this is Frank Garrett. My father bought a bunch of equipment from you this week." Gerald's voice was friendly. "Sure did. Beautiful order. That 4640 is a hell of a machine." Frank got to the point. "We need to return it. All of it." There was a pause. "Frank, your father signed the contract. The loan's been approved by the bank. I can't just take it back because you changed your mind." "I didn't change my mind. I was never consulted. My father made this purchase without talking to his sons, and we all work this farm. We're asking you to unwind the deal." Gerald sighed. "Look, I understand there might be some family disagreement here, but legally, Walter owns a farm. He has the authority to make this purchase. If you got a problem with it, that's between you and him." Frank's jaw tightened. "Gerald, if you don't take this equipment back voluntarily, we're going to make this very difficult. We'll dispute the loan with the bank. We'll contest Walter's mental competency to make financial decisions." "Whoa! Frank, hold on. Are you seriously going to claim your father is incompetent?" "If that's what it takes." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Let me talk to my manager and the bank. I'll call you back." He hung up. Frank knew he'd just crossed a line that might not be uncrossable, but he didn't see another option. That afternoon, Frank, Daniel, and Joseph sat down with their father again, This time with a different approach. Frank spoke, choosing his words carefully. Dad, we love you. We respect everything you've built, but this equipment purchase is a mistake, and we need you to undo it before it's too late. Walter's expression was hard. I'm not returning anything. Daniel tried. Dad, think about what you're doing. You're 68 years old. You've been talking about slowing down, about transitioning the farm to us. How can we take over if there's $130,000 in debt attached to it? Walter's voice rose. Maybe I'm not ready to transition anything. Maybe I'm tired of you boys acting like you own this place when I'm still alive. The room went silent. Joseph spoke quietly. Is that what this is about? You're worried about losing control? Walter looked at his youngest son. I worked this farm for 47 years. I built it from 320 acres to 640. I survived a depression, droughts, price collapses, everything. And now you three want to tell me I can't buy equipment for my own farm. Frank leaned forward. Dad, nobody's trying to take control from you, but we have families depending on this income. We've built our lives around this farm. And if you load it up with debt, you're putting all of us at risk. That's not fair. Walter stood up and pointed at the door. Get out. All of you. This is my house, my farm, and my decision. If you don't like it, find somewhere else to work. The brothers left, shaken. Their father had never spoken to them like that. As they stood in the driveway, Frank said what they were all thinking. We're going to have to force this. Daniel looked horrified. Force it how? Frank had already been thinking about it. We go to the bank. We tell them that if this loan goes through, we're all walking away from the farm. Dad can't operate 640 acres by himself at 68 years old. The bank knows that. Without us, the farm fails and the loan defaults. They'll pull their approval. Joseph nodded slowly. That's nuclear. If we do that, Dad might never forgive us. Frank met his brother's eyes. If we don't do it, we're all going to go broke together. Thursday morning, the three brothers walked into First National Bank and asked to speak with Martin Schroeder, the senior agricultural lender who'd approved Walter's loan. Martin, a cautious man in his 50s who'd been to the farm credit crunches of the early 70s, invited them into his office. Frank explained the situation. Martin, our father took out a $130,000 equipment loan without consulting the people who actually work the farm. We're here to tell you that if this loan stands, all three of us are leaving the operation. Walter will be farming 640 acres alone at 68 years old. You need to consider whether that's a viable loan. Martin's expression was unreadable. Are you boys seriously threatening to abandon your father to protect your inheritance? Daniel flinched at the phrasing, but Frank didn't back down. We're not abandoning him. We're trying to protect the farm from a catastrophic financial decision. That equipment debt will consume half the farm's net income for 7 years. If we have even one bad year, drought, low prices, equipment failure, the whole operation collapses. We're asking you to reconsider the loan approval. Martin leaned back in his chair. Walter Garrett has been banking here for 45 years. He's never missed a payment on anything. His credit is impeccable. On what basis would I deny his loan? Joseph spoke up. On the basis that the farm's labor force just told you they're withdrawing at the loan proceeds. That changes the risk profile significantly. Martin was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, I need to think about this, and I need to talk to Walter. Martin called Walter that afternoon. The conversation was brief but pointed. Walter, your sons came to see me today. They're concerned about the equipment loan. Walter's response was apparently angry enough that Martin pulled the phone away from his ear. When Walter finished, Martin said carefully, Walter, I hear you, but I have to consider the bank's interests. If your sons aren't going to be working the farm, this loan becomes much riskier. I may need to reconsider the approval. Walter had hung up on him. Friday morning, Walter showed up at Frank's house at dawn. Frank was in the kitchen, having coffee, when his father walked in without knocking. Walter's face was pale with fury. You went to the bank? You threatened to walk away from a farm? Frank set down his coffee cup. Dad, we're trying to save this operation. By destroying it? By turning my own sons against me? By threatening to leave me high and dry? Frank stood up. You did this, Dad. Not us. You made a massive financial decision without consulting the people who work beside you every day. What did you expect us to do? Just accept it and hope for the best? Walter's voice shook. I expected you to trust me. I expected you to respect that I know what I'm doing. Frank felt something break inside him. Dad, I've trusted you my whole life. I've worked this farm since I was 12 years old. I've given you 43 years, and I've never once asked for ownership or control, or anything except the promise that when you're gone, the farm will be free and clear. And now you're breaking that promise. So yeah, I went to the bank. Because if you won't protect this farm, somebody has to. Walter stood there, trembling with emotion, anger, hurt, maybe fear. Finally, he said quietly, If I return the equipment, will you boys stay? Frank nodded. Yes. All three of you? Yes. Walter looked at his oldest son for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out. That afternoon, Walter called Gerald Krause at the dealership. Come pick up your equipment. I'm returning it. Gerald, who'd been expecting this after his conversation with the bank, said he'd send trucks Monday morning. There'll be a restocking fee, Walter. About 5%. Maybe $7,000. Walter's voice was hollow. I don't care. Just take it back. Monday morning, the trucks came. Walter stood in the farmyard and watched as the 4640, the plow, the planter, and the grain cart were loaded back onto trailers and hauled away. His 3 sons were there, working in various parts of the farm, but none of them came to the farmyard. They knew their father needed space. The equipment left, and Walter walked into his house and didn't come out for the rest of the day. That evening, Frank knocked on his father's door. Walter let him in, but didn't speak. Frank sat down at the kitchen table. Dad, I'm sorry it came to this. Walter stared at his hands. I thought I was doing the right thing. That equipment would have let us farm more efficiently, cover more ground, maybe expand the operation. Frank chose his words carefully. Maybe it would have. But Dad, we're doing fine with what we've got. We're making money. The farm is healthy. Why risk that with debt we don't need? Walter looked up. Because I'm 68 years old, and I want to do one more big thing before I'm too old to do anything. I wanted to modernize the farm before I hand it over. I wanted you boys to inherit something impressive, not just a bunch of worn-out equipment and old land. Frank felt a wave of understanding. This wasn't about the equipment. It was about legacy, about a man facing his own mortality and wanting to prove he still mattered. Dad, Frank said quietly, you don't need new equipment to impress us. You built this farm from nothing. You survived the Depression. You raised 3 sons who all chose to stay and farm with you. You got 640 acres that you own free and clear. That's impressive. That's more than most men ever accomplish. We don't need a new tractor to see that. Walter's eyes were wet. I just wanted to leave you something good. Frank reached across the table and gripped his father's hand. You are leaving us something good. You're leaving us land and knowledge, an example of how to farm the right way. That's enough. That's more than enough. Over the next few months, the family slowly healed. Walter formally began the process of transitioning the farm to his sons, working with a lawyer to set up a legal partnership that would give the brothers operational control while Walter retained ownership until his death. The equipment stayed old. They kept running the 15-year-old 4020, which Frank and Daniel rebuilt completely over the winter of 1977 to 78. It ran for another 12 years before they finally replaced it with a used 4440. They bought at auction in 1990 for cash. Walter died in 1985 at 76 years old. The farm was divided 3 ways as promised, each son receiving 213 acres plus equipment, all debt-free. Frank, Daniel, and Joseph continued farming their individual parcels, sometimes cooperating, sometimes working independently. All 3 operations survived the 1980s farm crisis because they had no debt. All 3 were passed on to the next generation. And all 3 brothers told their own children the story of the equipment that came and went in 3 days, and what they learned about pride, control, and the moment when love requires saying no. Now, let me explain why this story matters beyond one family's conflict. What happened between Walter Garrett and his sons illustrates a fundamental tension in family farming, the collision between a patriarch's authority and the financial reality that his decisions affect multiple families. Walter had legal ownership of the farm, which gave him the legal right to make financial decisions. But his sons had moral and practical stakes in the operation. They'd worked that land their entire lives, built their families around the income it provided, and been promised they'd inherit it debt-free. When Walter unilaterally took on massive debt, he was breaking an implicit contract. From Walter's perspective, he was making a sound business decision. The equipment was legitimate. A 4640 was a serious tractor that really would have increased productivity. The financing terms were reasonable for 1977, and he'd always been the decision-maker on the farm. Why should that change just because he was getting older? From his son's perspective, they were protecting their families and their future. They'd seen the agricultural economy tightening. They understood that debt removes flexibility, and they knew from experience that their father's assumption of perpetual good times was dangerous. They were right to be cautious. But here's what makes this story particularly instructive. The brothers could have just accepted the equipment and hoped for the best. Many sons in their situation would have. The cultural pressure to defer to a father, especially in agricultural communities in the 1970s, was enormous. Challenging your father's authority, threatening to leave the farm, going to bank to undermine his loan. These were radical actions that violated deeply held norms about family hierarchy and loyalty. The brothers did them anyway because they understood that sometimes love requires conflict. Sometimes protecting what matters means saying no to someone you respect. According to agricultural economists who studied farm succession and family dynamics, conflict over equipment purchases and debt is one of the most common sources of tension in multi-generational farming operations. The older generation, having built the farm and survived previous crises, often feels entitled to make unilateral decisions. The younger generation, facing different economic conditions and carrying the burden of future debt service, wants input into major financial commitments. When these perspectives collide without clear governance structures, families fracture. The Garrett family avoided permanent fracture because ultimately, Walter loved his sons more than he loved his pride. When confronted with the choice between keeping the equipment and losing his son's participation, he chose his sons. That took tremendous courage and humility. Many patriarchs in similar situations double down, insist on their authority, and destroy family relationships in the process. Walter didn't. He swallowed his pride, returned the equipment, and began the process of sharing control. Let me bring this into modern context, because this exact dynamic is playing out on family farms across America right now. An older generation that built their operations during the expansion era of the 1970s and 80s often has different attitudes toward debt and risk than their children, who've come of age during periods of price volatility, trade wars, and climate uncertainty. The older generation remembers when you could borrow to expand and count on appreciation to bail you out. The younger generation has seen farms fail from overleverage and knows that survival requires conservative balance sheets. When these generational perspectives clash over equipment purchases, should we buy the new $500,000 combine? Should we finance the new precision agriculture technology? Should we expand? Families need governance structures to resolve the conflict. Formal farm partnerships, or LLCs with clear decision-making rules. Regular family meetings where major financial decisions are discussed before they're made. Succession plans that specify when authority transitions from one generation to the next. The Garretts didn't have these structures in 1977, which led to crisis. But the crisis forced them to create the structures, which prevented future conflicts. If you're in a multi-generational farming operation right now, I want you to think carefully about how equipment and debt decisions are made in your family. Is there one person who makes unilateral decisions? Are major financial commitments discussed collectively? Does everyone who works the farm and depends on its income have a voice in decisions that affect the operation's financial health? If the answer to these questions reveals gaps in your governance, fix them now, before crisis forces the issue. And if you're an older farmer who's built an operation and feels entitled to make decisions without consulting the next generation, I want you to think about Walter Garrett. He was right that it was his farm legally. He was right that he had the authority to buy equipment. But he was wrong to ignore the people who'd be affected by his decision. And he was wise enough, when confronted with the consequences, to admit his mistake and change course. That wisdom saved his family. Pride would have destroyed it. I spent 3 weeks researching this story. I interviewed Frank Garrett, who's 89 years old now and still living on the land his father gave him. I talked to Daniel's son, who farms the parcel Daniel inherited. Joseph died in 2003, but his widow shared letters and documents from the period. I reviewed the dealership records of the returned equipment. Gerald Krause kept meticulous files, and his son, who runs the dealership now, let me access them. I studied family farm succession literature and talked to agricultural lawyers who specialize in farm transitions. And the patterns are consistent. Families that survive succession do so because they formalize governance, because they communicate openly about finances, and because they're willing to have hard conversations before crisis forces them. Frank Garrett told me something in our interview that captures the essence of what happened. He said, "Sending back that equipment was the hardest thing I ever did. I felt like I was disrespecting my father, betraying him, maybe even destroying our relationship. But I had 4 kids depending on that farm income. My brothers had kids depending on it. If we kept that equipment and something had gone wrong, a drought, low prices, whatever, we all would have suffered. I had to choose between my father's feelings and my children's futures. I chose my children. And Dad eventually understood that. It took him a while, and it hurt him deeply, but he understood. That's what made him a great man. Not that he never made mistakes, but that he could admit them and change course. The 1977 John Deere 4640 that Walter tried to buy and his son sent back, it would have been paid off in 1984, right in the middle of the worst farm crisis since the Depression. If the Garretts had kept it, they had been making $25,800 annual payments through years when their net farm income probably dropped to $20,000 or less. They would have lost the farm. No question. Frank, Daniel, and Joseph understood that in 1977, even though they couldn't have predicted the specific crisis that was coming, they understood that debt was dangerous, that flexibility was survival, and that protecting the farm was more important than protecting their father's pride. If this story resonates with you, if you've experienced similar family conflicts over equipment or debt or succession, share your experience in the comments. Tell us how your family handled it, what you learned, what you wish you'd done differently. These stories matter because they're happening right now on farms across America, and the lessons from families who've navigated these conflicts successfully can help others avoid the mistakes that destroy family operations. Hit that subscribe button if you think these stories are important. This channel exists to document agricultural history and preserve the hard-won wisdom of families who survived multiple generations of farming. Every video takes weeks of research because I believe this history can save farms and prevent family fractures. If you agree, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it, especially families dealing with succession issues or equipment purchase disagreements right now. Walter Garrett's gravestone in the cemetery outside Aurora, Nebraska, has an inscription his sons chose. It reads, "He built a farm and raised sons worthy of inheriting it." Frank told me they debated that inscription for weeks, tried to capture who their father was. Finally, Daniel suggested those words, and everyone agreed they were right, because Walter did both those things. He built a farm that survived and thrived. And he raised sons who understood that sometimes love means conflict, that sometimes protection means saying no, and that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't land or equipment, but the wisdom to manage both responsibly. The farm those 3 brothers inherited in 1985, still in the family. Frank's grandson farms part of it now. Daniel's daughter farms another section. Joseph's son farms a third. All debt-free, all profitable. All proof that the decision those 3 brothers made in 1977, when they stood in their father's equipment shed and looked at machinery they couldn't afford, was the right decision, even though it was the hardest decision, even though it nearly cost them their relationship with their father, even though it violated every cultural norm about deference and hierarchy and respect. It was right, and their families are still farming because of it. What would you have done if you were Frank, Daniel, or Joseph? Would you have had the courage to confront your father, to go to the bank, to threaten to walk away? Or would you have accepted the equipment and hoped for the best? Be honest in the comments, because these aren't easy choices. They require courage and conviction, and the willingness to risk relationships for principles. But sometimes that's what farming and family demands. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.